Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another Capstone Chat. And this week we have Amelia Ferrell Knisely, and she is an investigative reporter. So those of you who are interested in journalism, she's the gal to ask questions. She writes about poverty in West Virginia. She's always had a very strong social consciousness to all the work she's been doing. So welcome, Amelia. Please tell your story.
Hi, thank you guys for having me today. As you said, my name is Amelia, and I graduated from Shepherd in 2010, or no, yes, 2010. Sometimes I get my college and grad school confused. 2010, which is getting further and further behind me, sadly. So I was a political science major and a comm minor, and I came to Shepherd to be an attorney. But because of my great communications classes and getting hooked up with the journalism program there, I, at the end of my senior year, really decided I wanted to be a reporter. And I am from a small town outside of Charleston in West Virginia, and I graduated with just 24 people and had no exposure to journalism until I came to Shepherd. So it was just really life-changing for me, and that kind of set my path forward. So I went straight to grad school at Marshall and got my master's in communications, and I did a hybrid of communications and journalism classes, and just started freelancing around West Virginia just for different magazines and newspapers. And about a year after I finished graduate school, I also worked at Starbucks, so got to plug that too. I was trying to pay the bills. So about a year after I finished grad school, my friend at the time, who is now my husband, told me that his TV station was hiring producers, and I had only done print journalism, but I really needed a job. So I started working at a TV station here in Charleston and soon became a TV reporter. And I knew pretty early on TV was not what I wanted to do. I didn't really like the pressure to be putting on makeup as I was covering a fatal fire. But I just feel like I learned so much from that time, especially how to tell a story in like a minute and 15 seconds, which is a very valuable skill for any reporter. And also, I just really enjoyed the hustle of news. Like it really solidified to me, like, this is what I want to do. So even then, I found very drawn to stories about social justice and about poverty and homelessness. And those aren't really like the sexy stories that TV wants to tell. So I didn't get to do them that often, but that's really where my passion started. And then I moved to Nashville, where I worked for a nonprofit newspaper for a while. And then I went to the Tennessean, and that's the daily newspaper in Nashville. And I covered education. And so even though my beat included covering school board meetings and school finances and all the like humdrum of school beat, I used that beat to do a lot of reporting on the things I was passionate about. So in Nashville, there are a lot of homeless students, there are a lot of immigrants, and I use the education beat to kind of focus on issues that were affecting kids in school. So I was in Nashville for about 4 years when I unexpectedly saw that a program called Report for America was hiring a full-time reporter to be in West Virginia to cover poverty. I really had no plans of moving back here, not because I don't love West Virginia, just job-wise. I kind of felt like I didn't know where I could work to make a livable income. But that beat really called to me. And so in what year was it? 2019, my husband and I and our 8-month-old baby at the time, we moved back to West Virginia, and I started covering poverty for the Charleston Gazette-Mail. And I'm going to try to share my screen if I can. Do I do that, or can you do that for me? I can't remember.
You should be able to.
Okay. 1 second. Oh, I kept not seeing the button. I'm sorry. Am I missing? Brain isn't working today.
That's okay, because it says allow participants to share screen is on. So
Okay.
is it under the 3 dots where it says more down at the bottom of your screen?
No, usually I have a little button that says share and it's not there. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, well,
You know what? Let me do this. Let me go into participants and make you a co-host.
okay.
And then you will absolutely
Oh, wait, I think I see. Here we go. Let's see if that does it. Okay.
Yay. Okay.
Okay, now you can see. Sorry, guys. Tech troubles. Okay. Let me move this. Okay, so when I was at the Charleston Gazette Mail, just so you don't have to stare at my face the whole time, this was really, let me move this down here. Okay, so this was really my first like big story that I did. And the reason this story means a lot to me is that it didn't just come overnight. When I was in Nashville, that was the first time I had ever heard that students were homeless. And I'm not just talking about a family residing in a tent. This is any student who doesn't have a permanent place to sleep. So they could be doubled up on a couch, living in maybe a domestic violence shelter with their parents. And I reported a lot on that in Nashville. And so when I moved to West Virginia to write for the Gazette Mail, I started asking their education reporter, other people like, hey, has anyone written about homeless kids? And that had not been covered in the history of the newspaper. And so this was a very easy data to get. This is very easy data to get. And I put the story together and it really took off like wildfire. And it was this story that really like set me on a trajectory of focusing a lot of my poverty coverage on the barriers that kids face in Appalachia. So I was here for about 9 months and then went on maternity leave to have my second daughter. And while I was there, and I think this is an important part of my story because many of you, I'm sure, know that the journalism industry can be really volatile. So while I was on maternity leave, my editor was unexpectedly let go from the paper, and several reporters left the paper in protest of him being fired. And in that move, they started a nonprofit news website that's focused on investigative reporting, and it's the first of its kind here in West Virginia. And they asked me to go with them. So I switched jobs while I was on maternity leave, and now I'm at Mountain State Spotlight. And as I said, it's a nonprofit newsroom, and we really focus on accountability journalism. We kind of say our unofficial motto is sustained outrage. So when we report on something that is affecting West Virginians all over the board, we really stick with it and make sure that we're following it. So last year, I spent pretty much 1 year working on one story, and I wrote a couple of stories in between, but I really wanted to write about foster care. And for those of you, how many of you are from West Virginia originally? Want to raise your hand? Anyone? Okay, so I will tell you just a little brief tidbit about West Virginia foster care. So as most of you know, West Virginia is in the middle of an opioid crisis, and that combined with our generational poverty has really put weight on the foster care system. And it really is at a crisis level. We have about 7,000 kids in foster care, and we have the most kids per capita in foster care. And we lead the nation in kids being removed from their homes and CPS calls. And there are a myriad of reasons behind that, but it's very largely driven by the opioid epidemic and poverty. So when I was working back at the Gazette, I was covering just a daily story on a lawsuit. Our state agency that runs the foster care program was being sued. Basically, the lawsuit said you violated the constitutional rights of all 7,000 kids in care. And it had like the most horrific things you've ever read in this lawsuit. And there was just one sentence in there, or two sentences in there, that said or alleged that a girl had been sent to an out-of-state facility in Ohio where she was sexually abused and made to do physical labor. And I was like, huh? I didn't know we sent kids out of state. And I certainly didn't know that they could end up at abusive out-of-state facilities. So then, as I said, I switched jobs. I came back from maternity leave. And as I started investigating this one specific children's home in Ohio, I quickly learned that we contracted with 40 homes, and about 70% of them had really bad histories, whether it was in the media or through public records. They had been sued for very similar things as this other home: sexual assault, sexual abuse, physical abuse, etc. So I spent a year last year looking into our use of out-of-state facilities, and I used public records to do that story. I didn't get to do a lot of interviews because the state would not talk to me about it. So it took about a year to file close to 50 Freedom of Information Act requests. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, that is the tool that we use as citizens, but certainly as reporters, to get public records. And public records are any data that the government collects. So for me, I was specifically looking at our contracts with these homes, when they started, what they were saying, trying to get an idea of how many kids were going to them, and also the inspection reports. So those inspection reports really guided my reporting and saying like, hey, you even flagged yourself that this kid had his arm broken at a facility, but yet you left the kid there. So that was what I spent last year doing. So I'll show you that. So this was like, I call this my fourth baby, because it was a year of work. So this story, it just has met, I ended up actually doing a 3-part series with, you'll see her name right here, Molly Bourne. She's a freelance reporter. And so we teamed up and did 3 stories on the foster care. And I took the lead on this one, and she took the lead on the other 2. And it really, it's crazy. You look through it and it doesn't probably look like it took a year of work, but this really was a full year of filing records requests. And along with the records requests, every good story has a person. So on your screen here, you see Mason, and Mason lives in Calhoun County. And it took us about probably 6 or 9 months to find Mason. He was abused in an out-of-state facility and was drugged multiple times to get him to comply. And Mason was so brave in sharing his story with us and with the world. And because he was, I would say this to anyone sharing a traumatic story, but especially because he was 15, I spent a lot of time talking to Mason, like, hey, for the rest of your life, when someone Googles your name, they're going to know that you were assaulted at a facility. They're going to know that you were sexually abused at a facility. Are you okay with that? And he said, I want to do this to help other kids. And so Mason kind of brought the story together with the public records and a person. And I think I have one more photo of him and his mom down here. He ended up getting adopted, which was such a hopeful note in an otherwise not hopeful story. But this is Mason and his mom. Yeah, and so Monica said also, like, just kind of to talk a little bit about how I spend my days. I will say every day looks very different, but a lot of my days, I usually write about a story a week or once every 2 weeks. I only work part-time right now because I have 3 kids. But my days are a lot of getting emails and calls from people giving me story ideas. So vetting those, seeing if that's something I want to pursue. Of course, my editors assign me stories sometimes, and just really looking at stepping back and saying, okay, what are the pieces that the story needs? Does it need public records? Let me go ahead and file those requests, because sometimes they can take up to 6 months to get, if not longer. Who am I going to talk to? We don't just want to write from research. I want a real person to help me tell the story. And because I write about very sensitive topics, poverty, welfare, homelessness, foster care, it takes a long time and such bravery from these people. So that's like a lot of my work is talking with people, making sure they understand what they're signing up for, making sure they're a good fit. Sometimes they seem like they're a good fit on paper and then they're not. And then just putting it all together. And I feel like so little what I do is actually writing. A lot more of it is research and talking to people and fact checking, but that I enjoy that part of the job too. And I've been focused a lot, I'll show you one more story, on welfare this last year. So emergency food assistance programs, also on unemployment as well. So this is a story that I just published a few weeks ago, and just used some federal data to see that we had stockpiled this much money. And that was something I spent a couple of weeks putting together. So yeah, I'm trying to think. Also, right now we're in the legislative session. This is the last week. So I'm also constantly looking at bills. And unfortunately, in my kind of piece of the puzzle, most bills that have to do with what I write about are making the problem worse. So I tend to do a lot of like what I call defense journalism, which is saying, hey, by the way, this is going to make it 10 times harder for people to apply for SNAP or WIC, or this is going to make it a lot harder for you to file for unemployment. So that's kind of what the last month or 2 months of my life has looked like. So yeah, that was a lot. Sorry. So please ask questions and let me know what you want to chat about. Hopefully that all made sense. My word vomit there. Oh, yes. Okay, so Patty.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you find sources? And I know people in Appalachia can have a tendency to kind of want to keep to themselves. How do you get people to talk to you?
Yeah, that, like I said, that is a huge part, a difficult part of my job. And it kind of goes on both ends. So I'll say with like sensitive things, I have used Facebook a lot, mostly because of COVID. I had my I've had 2 babies in a pandemic, which in retrospect was insane. But I've just for my own safety, I've been home a lot. My work doesn't even have an office. So I've been using Facebook a lot and Facebook groups. And my advice for that is I just am super transparent. Like, hi, I'm a reporter. This is what I'm working on. This is my website. Send me a Facebook message or text me. In West Virginia, I do feel like Facebook is the best way to connect with people. Twitter is very, we call it liberal West Virginia. So it's not indicative sometimes of how really West Virginia is. So I use Facebook and also just like word of mouth. I'll talk to nonprofits and say, hey, I know you guys work with people who are living on the streets. I'm looking for XYZ. Could you help me? And those relationships don't come overnight. Thankfully, I'm going into my 3rd year. So people typically now trust me to tell those stories, but it does take some time. And I don't, I have a story coming out in a few days that I desperately needed someone who uses SNAP, which is a food assistance program. And I have not found anyone. I've struck out many times. So I'm not always a success, but that's usually how I go about it. And I wanted to say on the other end, I mean, I need, sometimes I need state employees or lawmakers to talk to me, and they don't always want to. There's a very anti-media feeling in different parts of state government and lawmakers. And so I've really grown in my ability to use public records to tell stories and not always rely on a government official to tell me what I need to know.
Amelia,
Thank
can
you.
you stop sharing your
sorry.
screen so we can see
Yeah.
you better?
Oh yeah, sorry.
That's
Are
okay.
you-
Thanks.
Okay, one second. Let me, if I can do this.
I have faith you can do it.
Okay, that didn't do it, did it? Okay. Sorry, it's covering my. Okay. My gosh, I'm sorry guys. Why am I so horrible at Zoom? Oh, here we go. Okay, sorry, it was hidden. Okay, there we go. All right. Patty, did that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Kayla.
I remember you were talking about looking at different public records and doing a lot of research with your stories. I work for the Picket now, and the biggest story I'm working on is asking students how do they feel about the new mask mandate to where we don't have to wear masks in certain buildings. So I'm going around and interviewing students and asking them, how do they feel and what more do you think Shepherd should implement in the future? How would you answer that question?
Like, how would I answer that question if you were interviewing me, or how would I go about asking that to people?
Both, actually.
Oh, okay. I used to work for the Picket, so that makes me happy. Gosh, okay. Well, I think you're asking the right question. I think sometimes you have to let people's answers guide your next question. So so that might be a little broad, but it might be a good jumping off point. So, and I think too, not everyone feels comfortable sharing if they've had COVID or not. But if you can say like, how has anything in your life or in your close family affected how you feel about this decision? And they might say, oh, actually, I lost my grandma to COVID. So that's why I'm very wanting to continue wearing a mask. That might get you in a little bit deeper. Gosh, to answer that question, I was just telling Monica, I am still recovering from COVID from January. So I am still wearing my mask because I still don't feel 100%. And this year at the legislature, they have 0 COVID protocol. So I would say, I just think we're so close to being out of school and so close to getting warm weather and being able to spread out a little bit. I would like to see masks a little bit longer, but I'm not a health professional. I'm a journalist, but that's just my own personal opinion. So, but good luck with your article. That sounds really interesting.
Thank you.
Michelle.
Yeah. So what is your favorite story that you wrote?
Ooh. Okay. I have 2. I'm going to say foster care just because I've never worked. I used to be a daily reporter who wrote 3 stories a day. So to have a whole year to write something that was really empowering. And I just felt like every odd was in front of me, both from like the people who in government were trying to block records that I wanted, or it felt like they were, to just being pregnant. And I just everything, that story means a lot to me. And I really am passionate about fighting for justice for these kids who are out of state. And I think second to that, I did a story in Nashville. I covered education in one of the richest communities in America. and I did a story about homelessness there. And it took a long time because people didn't want to acknowledge that there were also homeless people living in their community. And that story actually spurred a huge donation that ended in them building a homeless shelter. And so it was just cool it's not very often that we get to see immediate change like that, or at least in my beat. So that story means a lot to me, that people were willing to share their story about living on the streets in such a rich community. So that was a good question. Robert.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned that you worked on TV.
Yeah.
What was that experience like? And because like I kind of want to do something like that. So what would your advice be for working on TV?
I'm sure after the Zoom presentation, you can tell I'm not meant for TV news. But let's see, my experience. I mean, it was really overall a positive experience because it was my first full-time journalism job. And like I said, I mean, it's very go, go, go. Every day is different. Tuesday might be covering a boring school board meeting, and Wednesday you might be covering a fire where 7 people have died. And then Thursday you could be at the legislature. And I like that because it definitely challenged me. There's also, I think, because of budget cuts in journalism, a lot of TV news is like what we call one-man band reporting. So you're shooting your own video, you're editing your stuff, and you're going on TV. So just, it's a lot. But I meant to say this earlier. I think something that I really took away from it now, and the industry has even changed just in the 10 years I've been a reporter. A lot of news now is multimedia, no matter what. So I still do audio, what I call audiograms for my stories now. I have done video like production for my stories now, just my print stories, and like embedded in there. So I still use a lot of the same skills. And I think probably I don't want to say it's a negative, but one of the things I didn't like so much about TV news is, like I said, you have 1:15, sometimes 2 minutes to tell a story. So if you're really craving investigative journalism, or you want to go back and follow that story, you don't always get that chance. Some TV stations have investigative reporters, but in smaller markets, especially in West Virginia, it's a lot of daily news. So do you have any other questions about that?
No, not that coming up right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to drop my contact info in here at the end, and y'all are welcome to send me any questions that you want, any follow-up questions. Okay, Grace.
So you had said that you moved from the West Virginia to Tennessee and then back to West Virginia. How did you find that change? And like, how do I put this? How would you say that the job market is different in Tennessee versus in West Virginia? And how did you go about finding a job in both?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I moved to Nashville because my husband is a musician. So when we were getting married, I was like, okay, I mean, I was making so little money in TV news at the time. So it just didn't really make sense for us to stay here. So I moved there, and I actually ended up I worked a communications job. I mean, I worked at the Tennessee Bar Association, which is like the attorney bar. And so they had a magazine, and I wrote for their magazine, but I also did all their press. And it felt a little weird because I'd been a journalist, but I needed a job. So I did that. But the great thing about it being in a bigger city is there were so many journalism opportunities. I mean, it seemed like every other week there was some type of nonprofit news site starting or a new magazine. And yeah, I mean, sometimes the pay wasn't always great, but it was a lot easier to kind of like put things together. So I would like freelance on the side, or I'd be writing for five different magazines at the time. And then I eventually made my way to the Tennessean, where I was for a while until I moved back. I will say, I think Report for America is a nonprofit that staffs underserved communities with news. And that is the place I applied to get my job in West Virginia. So they worked with the newspaper in West Virginia to create that position, and they pay most of the funding for it. Had Report for America not existed, I know I wouldn't be here doing this job, because newspapers can't afford to have someone covering poverty. They're struggling to fill like the normal beats of political and health and all that. So through Report for America, I was able to come back. I think the job market in West Virginia is challenging, but I don't want to say that to discourage you, because, I know of reporting jobs that are open right now. It's just different. There's not as many freelance opportunities in West Virginia, but I also think from COVID, the journalism market is changing a lot. And I think we're going to see a lot more remote jobs. Even for local papers, they're still going to have you work remote. William. Yeah. Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh, so you talked about giving interviews and stuff, and like when you were giving your interviews or maybe commenting about your story, about giving like a such short time span, what are some of your tips to doing that?
As in turning a story around in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think for me, and I'm still growing in this even 10 years in, it's just being organized. So I really start at the beginning, like Tuesday morning when I start work. Okay, let me type up what am I trying to answer? What's the central question of the story? And I really feel like whether it's a long story or a short story, a story can only make one point. Too many off ramps confuse people. So I will say, what is the point of the story? And this might be me, but my trick is if I cannot explain the story to myself in the shower in a minute and a half, I don't know what I'm talking about. That's my rule. So I have to be able to tell it to myself, and then I know I'm ready to write about it. And then I make a list of everyone I need to contact. So like, these are the people that it can't go forward without hearing from. Even if it's no comment, I at least have to give these 5 people or however many a chance to talk. And then I have a second list is if I could get anyone, who would that be? And that's just kind of how I go about it. And I think, I also try to be in constant communication with my editor. So by the end of day 2, here's where I am, here's what I haven't gotten yet, here's where this is coming. So that way there's no deadline crisis where I'm not quite done. But yeah, I think just being organized is really key, especially in the beginning. So that way you're thinking through who all do I need to talk to give yourself as many hours sometimes as you can to hear back from people. April.
Hello. It's really cool to speak to a journalist because I actually used to be a photojournalist for the Marine Corps, and I found myself being very fatigued. Sometimes the news was really heavy. So I was wondering, what are some things that you do to not only combat that fatigue, but prevent being burnt out?
That is a great question. I am still growing in that. I think mental health and taking care of our mental health is still a journey that even as a country we're going on, but certainly as journalists. And so this is embarrassing, but I never even took a mental health day until last year. That was my first ever mental health day. And I really regret that because I would just hoard my vacation days, in case I got sick or my kids get sick. And so I think putting space for yourself to breathe is really important. And even after working a year on foster care, I have 3 kids under 3. And spending a year reading the most horrendous things you could ever imagine happening to children, I needed a break. And so I'm doing a few little foster care stories right now, but I told my editors, like, I need a good 6 months before I have to go back in and read these court documents. And they were understanding of that. And so I think it's just, and that's not every editor would be, but I think it's just making sure you know where you are mentally. And I've also had days where I've done interviews that were just so heavy that I just turned off my computer, went for a drive, went to the supermarket, did something that is so, out of not journalism, so that I can come back later that night and finish if I need to, but just to like give myself a little bit of time to breathe. And I wish if I could like shout from any rooftop, it would be to anyone, but especially journalists, to use mental health days and protect yourself, because there's just not a lot of, I've worked, in like 7 different newsrooms at this point. I've never had any trauma training, never had any of that. And so it really is about us making sure that we're looking out for ourselves. And I hope that the journalism industry will change in that way. So.
Thank you so much. It's really important to hear that from someone in the field. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. That was a great question and probably a good reminder. I need to do that. All right, James.
Something you said when you were talking about working on TV news was like the skills of compressing a story down into like a minute and a half, 2 minutes. What are some tips you have when doing that?
well, I'm going to go back to my shower trick. If you can't tell the story in a minute in the shower, you don't know what you're writing about. I do think that's a real thing, or I'll say it to like my husband or a friend. I think that's a real thing. And I think too, just, yeah, if you can write down, if I can only tell somebody 3 things about this story, what would they be? Okay, now say, what are 2 things? Okay, what would 1 thing be? And maybe you can get into all 3, but I really firmly believe a story can only make 1 point. And I would just encourage you to like really write it out and keep working and working and working. And I think the tighter your idea, and of course, don't go into the story thinking you know how it's going to end, because we want to be curious and we want the reporting to guide us. But the tighter you are in the beginning, at least what you're trying to answer, not the answer, is important. And I still struggle all the time. I mean, I got to cut like 500 words from a story this evening. So who should I be giving advice? Probably not.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Kayla.
I'm sorry, I'm like over here like focusing on you and also taking notes of like what you're saying. But you talked about defense journalism. I know that that can be tricky for whenever you're trying to get your point across, but you don't have a lot of information that really supports what you're trying to say. What are tips and tricks for defense journalism when it comes to certain topics?
Well, I think I would say first, it's not always, of course, it's not my opinion. I'm not the one saying the bill is bad. It's backed by research.
Right.
So thankfully, some of my strongest sources now are policy people in West Virginia and federally. I have like really strong federal sources on SNAP and WIC and other welfare programs who will email me and say, hey, heads up, this bill is going to cut 50,000 people off of welfare or whatever it is. So I think it's just really important to always have your research with you. And if you don't have the research and you can't cite it, then I can't write that story. But I just try really hard to think about, okay, who are local people I can talk to about this, whether it's people who have experienced it, whether it's people who are researching it, and who are national people. It's a little bit harder to do national with West Virginia because people usually don't care that much about us, but every now and then I'll find people that are really valid sources. So I just kind of thankfully, I mean, every now and then I'll also read the bill and think this is a horrible idea, but people who are much smarter than me are paid to look into this full time. So those are the people I rely on to do my work.
And my other question, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
You went to Marshall for your grad.
Yes.
How was that like?
I loved it. I mean, I think when I graduated in 2010 from Shepherd, newspapers were shutting down left and right. I'm not gonna say the journalism industry has gotten better, but I felt like I wanted to get my master's right away to give myself a leg up in the job search, and also just to kind of let the industry stabilize. LOL, it never did, but I thought maybe at the time it would. But it was a really positive experience. And looking back, I wish I would have just done journalism, to be honest, but I felt like I wanted to do communications and journalism. In case journalism didn't pan out, I would have a communications degree as well. And I will say, as a woman, having a master's degree has been really instrumental in securing any type of pay raise that I've been able to do. So you don't have to have a master's to be in journalism, but it has certainly helped me, especially being a woman in this field.
Thank you.
And I got to go for free. So that was great. I really had a wonderful experience in Marshall. So Monica.
Yeah, your article on foster care, it was a year of your life, right? You said that's a long time. And then you publish it in Mountain State Spotlight, and that's kind of the culmination. And I'm wondering, have you ever considered trying to reach a wider audience with some of your writing, like maybe trying for a publication like Harper's or writing a book? Do you ever feel like, you're in a fairly small, you're in a small publication, online publication? Have you ever really wanted to, that's a lot of your life to not have the biggest audience see it, maybe?
That's a good question. I've never thought about that. I mean, I've done, like, I just had an article come out with my foster care article. I wrote an article for USA Today that linked to it. So I've had opportunities throughout my career to write for national publications, but I think I kind of have 2 answers, because I feel I'm really passionate about local news, and specifically in West Virginia, we have so few newspapers, so few reporters, that I believe that West Virginians of any socioeconomic status deserve investigative reporting. So that really drives me to stay here. I don't think that just because you live in McDowell County, you don't deserve to know exactly what your lawmakers are doing, because it affects them. So I don't really feel like I'm missing out by not being on a bigger audience, because the audience I want to reach hopefully will read my stuff. And even though we are an online only publication, we give our content to everyone for free, like to any newspaper. So we have newspapers around the state, like very small newspapers, pick up our stuff. And I really love that part of our mission. I do have kind of a dream of being a national correspondent for Appalachia, just because I feel like our stories are told so poorly, especially during Trump years. I just hated the way that we were reduced to just like a single person and how they voted and how we think. And Appalachia is so diverse in many ways. So I do have that dream, but right now, I mean, this is what I feel really called to do.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Luke.
Hey, what was your like favorite class at Shepherd, or one that you found most beneficial to like your field in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was a political science major, and I feel like even though I took a lot of pre-law classes, because that's what I was going to do, they have been so beneficial to me because I graduated understanding the political system and legislative system, I think, better than a lot of my colleagues who came out of J school. So I'll say that up front. I think sometimes people feel like, oh, I can't go into journalism because I don't have a journalism degree. That's not true, because whatever thing or topic that you bring into this career is really valuable. I work with reporters who are biology majors, and they cover science now, and they have such a deeper understanding of the environment than I ever would. And with comm classes, all of my video editing classes were just so good. And I have used those skills in many walks of life and have been the only journalist in many newsrooms who knew how to edit video. So I am really thankful for all of those classes, because just learning how to lay sound, and I may not be doing documentaries anymore, I'm doing 1-minute videos, but I use those skills, and I use some of the same programs even to this day. So definitely those. Michelle.
So with all the fake news, conspiracy thing, how do people trust sources from news reporters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I've worked a lot to let go of control of that. But I think the best thing you can do is just back up everything you say. At the end of the day, if someone's not going to believe what you've reported, they're not going to believe it. But I feel I just think it's a really, really good tool to be able to source as many people as you can. Maybe not just one think tank, look for 2. And I had a story even recently where I went into it thinking one thing was going to happen, and the sources I talked to told me the opposite. And I had sources on 2 sides, and I had to work that into a story together. And so I think it's just about doing that as much as you can. And I think it's also, as reporters though, it's okay to say things that are true and not have to source it. And so I've grown a lot in saying, when I write a lot about child hunger, and I'll just say, this is going to cause more kids to be hungry, and I don't need a source to tell me that. So I think it's both of those. It's just kind of like making sure you're researching what you're saying, but also don't be afraid to speak truth to people in power. And what will be, will be. I can't control how everyone, how they get their news, but I try really hard to be very fair and accurate and build trust in my communities. Ricky.
Yeah, so I was wondering, I'm sorry if you've answered this question to some degree already, but I'm aware that you're trying to raise a family, but do you see yourself like staying in West Virginia doing local news for a long time, or have you considered doing local news anywhere else before potentially moving on to like national correspondence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't see myself doing this anywhere else, at least right now. I think I have like a really good support network for having 3 children under 3. So that's important. And I have I've been able to work part-time for the last few years, which has been really hard in some ways, but really good for my family. And I get that time with my kids. Yeah, like I said earlier, I think I'm just really passionate about bringing news to West Virginia. And as far as the future, I don't, I don't know what it has for me or if other job opportunities will come along, and maybe even a national role for Appalachia will never even be a thing that exists. But right now, this feels like the right fit for me and my family. And I kind of just take it year by year, because I've definitely had jobs in the past that I thought, oh, I'll be here for 10 years, and then layoffs or life happens. So we just, year by year, figure it out.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. You guys have so many good questions. Shayna.
Hi, you mentioned before that you had wrote for like magazines and stuff while you were in Tennessee. I'm just curious to hear more about like some of the stuff you wrote about.
Sure. Gosh, it was all over the board. I mean, I got laid off in Nashville, so I had a season where I worked at a coffee shop and freelance to pay bills. And I am like a total indie rock, like not a country music girl at all. And I wrote for this website called The Boot, which was all about country music, and it's based in Nashville, and it has the biggest reach of anything I'll probably ever write in my entire life. And they paid so well, and I would just write about country music, and I didn't know what I was doing, but it worked out okay. I could put it together. So I did that for a while. But then I also pitched articles to magazines on homelessness. I did that, and I did some album reviews, kind of just whatever I could scrape together. I think, to like take a sidestep from your question, freelancing is really hard. It's kind of a mixture, right? At least the industry right now, for my friends who freelance, freelancing is getting further and further away from people saying, oh, what do you want to write about, or assigning you a story, and more to where they want you to come with them with a pre-reported story. And that's really hard, because I have friends who will put 8 to 10 hours, maybe even days, into reporting, give that to an editor, and be told no. And where I am right now in my life, I can't do that. And it was starting to turn that way in Nashville too, as well. But yeah, I mean, I definitely wrote news stories and covered things that I cover now, but it was a lot of really fun, like album reviews, and using a part of my brain that I hadn't used in a long time. Kayla.
I liked how you mentioned album reviews, because I actually did that as a story for Picket. But I have 2 questions. Where do you see yourself within the next 2 years?
In 2 years? Gosh, I mean, I hope I'm still here, but like I said, I just really have learned in my life to not plan. Like, people are like, my oldest daughter is 3, and they're like, where are you sending her to kindergarten? I'm like, I don't know. I'm just trying to get through 6 months. So I really have just learned, having so many jobs since I graduated from college, that, take it month by month, do my best, and then just kind of reassess what's working for our family and for myself.
Right. And for my second question, as a college student who is wanting to get into the journalism field, what are the biggest keys and tools that you would give to students like myself?
That's a great question. I mean, work on your portfolio. Think really hard about the stories that you're writing for the Picket. Think about what you like to write about. You may not always land that job out of college, but your passion will show in the things you're excited about. I think that every story can and maybe should be an investigative story. So think about, even at the Picket, like, how can you do an investigation? It may not be the deep dive that you would do in a year, but in a week, what could that look like? And I think too, show that you have, if this is something you're interested in, show that you have a multimedia presence. So being able to edit video, edit sound, shoot video with your phone. That's a big part of my job, and taking my own photography. And just even your social media presence. I mean, I recently just heard of somebody who applied for a job who the newspaper had hired a third-party company to screen their social media. So I think just making sure that your social media matches your brand as a reporter, but also doesn't have anything troubling on it, is really important in this. So, and yeah, I mean, I think just working on as many stories as you can to show that you can turn a story in a quick amount of time, because usually internships are more focused on those daily stories. They'll send the intern to go cover the fire, or some of the like more daily stuff. So just showing that you can write something quickly. Michelle.
So with the news being on multiple platforms like social media, TikTok, and all that stuff, do you believe like newspaper like the news stories on that is going to go obsolete?
Oh, that breaks my heart. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, my people who are a lot smarter than me and do this for a living say yes. I think I'm in a unique position in West Virginia where we see people that only read print. Like my parents are that way. They're not even going to go online to read what I report, right? Like they're only going to read it in the newspaper. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see like when the baby boomer generation moves is gone, what that does to newspapers. Because I think living in a mostly elderly state, I still see that need for print. Whereas my friends who are reporters in DC or even Nashville, that was the digital numbers were so much higher. But with Mountain State Spotlight, I mean, that's why our partnerships with print papers have been so important, because we just know a lot of people here either don't want to read their news online or they're in West Virginia and they don't have reliable broadband. But I hope not, because I love getting a newspaper. Anyone else? Those were such good questions.
Well, I actually have another question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So with like all the platforms and stuff, do you think there's going to be like a new way to get news? Because there are multiple ways. Do you think like towards the future there's going to be a new way that we all get it?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know. I have seen like a lot of momentum to be on TikTok as a reporter. That's not my thing. But I mean, there was even a debate on social media, on Twitter over the weekend about whether TikTok journalists were real journalists, but they're doing real work. They are. I mean, not all of them, right? Like some of it is biased trash, but like some of them are, especially right now in Ukraine and in Russia, there's a lot of on the ground reporting on TikTok, which is crazy. So I don't think we can discredit it and say it's not real just because it isn't a traditional print model. But I think what we need from the next generation of journalists is to bring quality reporting to whatever platform they're going to embrace. And I think I'm growing in like try to have a very clear voice as a reporter on poverty. Like I am fortunate that I get to cover what I call shouldn't be political issues, right? Like kids should not be going hungry. Kids should not be sleeping outside. So I try to have a really clear voice, but it's also super important that I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist. So I think it's going to be important for the next generation and my generation that we make sure we don't blur those lines, that we speak truth, but we're also upholding the ethics of journalism. And sadly, what I see in a lot of newer journalists, and even people my age too, is making the story about themselves. And that is not our job as reporters. So I think, I'm trying to think of an example, like if it's how a bill will impact you or how you feel overwhelmed covering a press conference, whatever it is, like our job is to be there and report for the people who can't be there. And so I think that's going to be important moving forward, is that we just uphold those ethics and make sure that we're giving people news and not our personal experience.
All right, guys, anybody have any more? Last chance. All right. Well, thank you so much, Amelia. I think you can tell by the number of questions and the depth of them that people were really curious about what you've done. And I really appreciate your taking the time. Students, I don't think I told you guys this, but Amelia and I spoke before you guys came in that before COVID, probably a year before COVID, I had wanted to start this capstone chat program, and Amelia was kind enough to be the first person to participate. And we had the class, everybody sitting in, L10G, and Amelia up on the screen, and Skype just failed in every possible way. Amelia's lips were moving, but no sound was coming to us. Students in the classroom couldn't ask her questions. So I would think that this is probably one of the only good things that has come out of COVID for me, is that we're able to actually embrace something like this that makes everybody available and an easy experience to talk. So anyway, I thank you very much for having the patience to come back to us and give us a second try.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for having me. I just dropped my contact info into the chat. Also put our website in here if you guys want to check that out. We do hire summer interns, I shouldn't say we do, we usually do. So I'll drop that in there too. And Report for America is the nonprofit program that I'm in. I think they're done with applications for this round, but they'll be back up next year taking applications. So please reach out. And it was really great. Your questions were all wonderful. So thank you guys.